Welcome to another BBA Roundtable discussion. Today we're going to explore the Building Safety Act and specifically the construction supply chain's expectations post-implementation. And Anil, we're going to come to you for this specific question regarding the Hackitt Report. Do you think that the legislation answers some of the original challenges that were posed?
Yes, Dame Judith identified 6 key areas that I think everyone agreed with, particularly about competence and about products, about the resident's voice and the process of building control. And there's some major steps forward in process. Some have already started. We've got Gateway 0, Gateway 1. We've got people thinking about the golden thread and the application of recording evidence the whole way through the design to the build to the occupation. If I have a concern, it's about the focus on only the in-scope buildings. We have legislation that is really tight for buildings that are over 18 metres and the other conditions that have to be required. I am not convinced that those behaviours, the behaviours will change for the rest of the building construction sector. And I think Judith identified a system failure, and I think we might be providing a solution to part of the system, a really good solution, but whether that lifts up competence, care, diligence and quality back into the system for the whole of it, I hope I'm persuaded that it is over time.
And Tim, what are your thoughts?
I would agree wholeheartedly with Neil that I don't think there were many people in the construction industry that would have disagreed with many of the key findings within the Hackitt Report. I think we've all been in the industry long enough to have come into contact with some of the criticisms that she made. I think from my point of view, I think I have a very personal opinion around the point that she made about the race to the bottom. And I think within the construction industry, we've failed to understand the difference between cost and value. And I think we were the pioneers of the term value engineering, which I think as a civil or a structural engineer might differ from the way that it's been interpreted within construction. And I think in a lot of cases in the past, value engineering has been about cutting costs and doing things as cheaply as possible without regard to the final product. And I think for me, the fundamental shift that should come out of the Hackitt Report and the fundamental change for the industry has got to be around recognizing the responsibility of everybody in the supply chain to deliver the right product, the right building at the end at the right price. I'm all for value, don't get me wrong, but I think that sometimes if value is compromised by cost, then you end up with a substandard product. And I think that was, for me, that was the thing that resonated from the report.
And James, coming to you, you know, as a voice of builders and construction, what's your view?
I think on the whole, there's been an immense amount of hard work, and I can see lots of positive steps to address every recommendation that was put forward. And you've got to applaud the industry in its response to that. It will be a slow journey because it's such a such a monumental shift, and I think people need to accept that and be patient. And I think we can see some of that. So the desire to shift the warranty requirements and increase that, address the Defective Premises Act and sort of hold people to account for a longer period of time. You know, that will come. Consultations haven't begun. So we've got still lots of steps to take. But I think from what we can see happened so far, I think you've got to applaud the people who have driven it to where it is now. But to really pick up the traction, you need a lot more people engaged to really drive it. And I think with all of these things, it's back to this competency question. You know, whether you're writing a standard process procedure, whether you're reviewing something, whether you are suitably qualified to make a judgment on site, competency is this key word. And without real key authors defining what the attributes are to competency within construction industry specifically and what that means will be a problem. So people are having to address that specifically now in their own way, and the fear is it will become another tick box exercise of pointing to a qualification, and that makes you suitably competent, and that won't be meeting the expectations of what Dame Judith was after. So I think that's a real problem, I think, simmering in the background that we've got to really face into and understand what it really means from a skills, knowledge, experience, professionalism standpoint, which will help to address the other things that are raised. But money is an overarching challenge. You know, we are in unprecedented times, from whether that's the war in Ukraine, Brexit, supply of materials consistency of those supply, right the way through to much broader, I think, challenges on funders and their interpretation of what they would expect out of these regulatory changes, has pinched margins way more than we've ever seen before. This is mimicking a recession in some respects because of the seismic shift, which comes risk, and people will price a risk. And as a consequence, you will see projects shelved, right? Because they can't be afforded to build. And we've seen that directly just from the output last year of secondary stair requirement and the political move of this is what we promote from the fire brigade. And you understand it and support the drive behind that. The challenge, and amongst that, is you're responding to that requirement without legislative guidance to support or justify its introduction, and therefore you're increasing cost. And at a time where affordability is low, the interest rates have gone up, borrowing interest rates have gone up, mortgage rates have gone up, the market isn't there. It can't accommodate the change that we're seeing and come out with a profit, and therefore are people going to look elsewhere to make their money, where we've already got a problem with the number of people involved in the industry and this knowledge gap that's coming our way. We have to address the resource first and foremost, and where's that coming from, and then understand how we're going to apply this competency measure. It's very, very complex.
And David, from your point of view, you're in a slightly different construction sector, aren't you?
Yeah.
So is that the same for you, or are you finding things to be different?
No, I think it's very much the same. I think the industry as a whole is aware of what's going on. It's not a wake up call for us. I think we probably recognised immediately after Grenfell and then after the Hackitt Report came out that things were going to be changing and changing massively. I think from my point of view as a contractor, the allocation of risk, as James has already spoken about, is very, very important. We've got to get away from the old push it down to the contractor and he'll manage the risk ethos. That is not acceptable. It's not the best place for risk to be placed at without any question of doubt, because all it means is that you've driven your price down, but now you're going to get a poor, low quality product. And there's no doubt at all about that. But then the poor, low quality product that may not necessarily comply with a whole pile of regulations, and bang, someone's going to end up in a court of law, and the test that needs to be gone through with that. I do think that it is interesting that will this make a sea change? Will this change the whole construction industry per se? I think somewhere I read that there was 27,000 buildings that currently sit within the framework for changes, and building owners are going to have to need to step up and put in place management procedures and processes for it. Is that going to drive trickle down into the rest of the construction industry? Hopefully it will. And I'm a positive thinker. I think it probably, if the construction industry does step up and improve the way it's doing stuff, that will, without question, without supply and demand, drive itself into the market. Are we going to be able to keep up with it? That's another big question. There are manufacturers out there who are already well ahead of the game, but we're going to go out there into the market and we're going to be looking for cheaper products. We're going to be looking for available products. Certainly at the end of COVID, you couldn't get drywall lining materials, you couldn't get thermal insulation. Off the back of the the first rollout of the Hackitt Report, we could not for life nor money get non-flammable insulation products to go onto a building, and it's still today having ramifications on what we're trying to build on our buildings, and how we can make products. You talked about standard products on buildings. We've got to try and make a product now do a job that it wasn't originally intended to do within the constraints of floor ceiling heights and architects' demands and all the rest of it. And that's a huge challenge for us. Where do we now go and stick our thermal insulation, whereas before a high density flammable product would achieve a far greater thermal load than a rock wool product or an equivalent. We've now got to find somewhere to put that insulation, and does that mean we now step up from outside and all of the waterproofing problems, etc., that come with it? So it's a challenging time for us to go.
So to put
forward.
that back to the manufacturers, I mean, Paul, I know you're not speaking for all manufacturers,
Yeah.
but how do you as a sector answer that call from the construction side?
I think you've just got to have. We all know that the buildings that we're building now, they're getting more and more complex to try and fit into that space. So even if you didn't have this change, the actual complexity of design from an architectural perspective is making, say, cavities larger, trying to make floor slabs smaller. To try and fit all that into there is difficult. And the only way you can do it is to collaborate. There's a lot of products within that space. And if it's from a testing, if it's from a literature of where they've been used together before, it needs to happen. But not just on a design stage. We see all the time on a site perspective, you've got completely different conditions. A building is never going to be exactly as it should be on paper, especially within a cavity space. Your building tolerances don't allow for it. So you have to allow more than, if you have a product that goes to a certain value cavity-wise, you've got to be able to go over that. You've got to consider these site conditions. I'm not sure all manufacturers would. You'd hope they would. We're constantly pushing for higher values for things like that. But when you start bringing all these other factors in, like thermal regulations, it does become difficult. But to go back to the original point, one point that was clear to us was around the ambiguous statements. So everything that we're putting out there now has to be very clear as to what it does. If it sits outside of it, we need to be going back and looking, rather than saying it's nothing to do with us. I think as a manufacturer, you've got to be involved in how can we solve this. If it's through testing to prove that it works in that scenario, we've got to be involved in that. And that will help drive the industry forwards. But then going back to your site level, we have to be policing that. And I think potentially from a product level, I know it depends on how the OPSS are going to be involved in that. But from a site perspective, actually carrying out them checks that the products are being used as they should be needs to happen.
Yeah, I think you've touched on a really important point to sort of link that directly to the question, I guess, the original challenges that have been set out and whether we are some way of meeting them. Yes, for sure. I think it will always, when you say it's unlimited fine and imprisonment for failure to comply, right? You're going to sharpen people's attention to what needs to be done, which, I wholeheartedly support. It's complex to see it through, but absolutely needs that. That will drive that culture shift. And being able to record what's happening for this, the golden thread, that's the thing that is the biggest challenge. You can design everything and you can pick up that designing and put it in an O&M health and safety file, which the CDM regs heavily faced into that issue before. Well, that's great, but the bigger issue is the variables during the build stages. And build stages, I encapsulate the final bit of specialist design as well as procurement. That whole stage of delivering a project, things can shift very quickly through other wider pressures that are not because someone's decided just to derail and do what they want. It's because there are material supply issues, or
Sure.
the person that was driving it has left or moved company, so there's wider issues. So I think the need for golden thread is very pertinent, seeing all stages through, and I think that was one of the challenges identified, and the requirement of these gateways faced very, very clearly into that, and the overarching regulatory responsibility being with the BSR definitely faces into the challenges that was identified. So I think some really positive steps are being made to address them. Yeah.
Sure. And Bill, coming to you to round off this conversation, really, no pressure at all. But I've heard, from Nick there talking about competencies being important. I've heard the words collaboration, sharing of information from yourself, Paul, has been, all of those being really important to take us through this. How important are those three things?
Well, they all are, and I think looking, the question that you posed back at the outset of this little discussion is, do you think the new legislation answers the original challenges set out in the Hackitt Report? I think thinking about it one way, you can say pretty definitely yes, in that all the sections of the Hackitt Report, as Neil outlined, they all follow through into various parts of legislation, so far as I can see it. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an expert, but that's certainly how it comes across. But I think that then begs the bigger question, can legislation answer the challenges of the Hackitt Report? And I think the answer to that is definitely no, because you have to look at the bigger picture. You've got to look at culture. It's got to be, in a sense, a pull model that people want buildings to be safe, people to be safe in safe buildings and feel safe in them. That was the kind of challenge that Dame Judith put out there, and you can't legislate to that. All you can do is inspire people to achieve it. And I think a lot of what we're saying here is, yes, okay, you can fulfill the transactional elements of legislation. Legislation will always be transactional in the way we're looking at it here. But actually it's this bigger inspirational piece that we've got to step up to. And I think that's where the proof of the pudding will be in the eating, as to what extent the industry does that.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed for your contributions, gentlemen.